Good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to today's session on research inclusion as a condition of funding. This session is being recorded and transcribed and will be uploaded to NIHR's YouTube channel after the event. For those requiring captions during today's session, please just click on the CC button to enable these. So my name is Emma Hadfield-Hudson, my pronouns are she, her, and I am one of NIHR's Research Inclusion Managers. And I'll just hand over to my colleagues to do quick introductions as well.
Hi everyone, my name's Nikki Hopkins. I'm also one of the Research Inclusion Managers at NIHR and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi everyone, my name's Becky Barnes. I am Senior Qualitative Advisor at the Research Support Service, and I also lead the Quality, Diversity and Inclusion Workstream for the RSS National Collaborative.
I am Chris Newby. I'm a Senior Quantitative Advisor at the Research Support Service. I'm a statistician with a interest in EDI.
Thanks, everyone. So the aims of today's session are to provide an overview of why NIHR are making these changes, what those changes look like, what inclusive research entails, and where to find further information and guidance. As we're going through the presentation, we realise it's difficult to encompass all of the language for all the disciplines that we fund at NIHR. However, we will be expecting researchers to apply the new conditions to all the disciplines. As we are very limited on time today and we have a high number of attendees, we're not going to be able to answer any questions live and directly today. However, the Q&A is open, so please do post your questions in the Q&A, and upvote as we go along, because we're going to take all these away and ensure that the most popular questions are answered within our supporting guidance. We also have a few links that you'll see in the slides today, and we're going to post those in the chat shortly, so you can access these as we go along. So just before we get started, we just want to do a very quick poll to get a feel for current understanding and confidence in this area. So shortly, you're going to see a message saying that a poll has started. If you can just click on this and complete the question, how would you rate your confidence and ability in considering inclusion in your research? So we'll just leave that for a few minutes to come through. Just another few seconds to get a few more votes in. Okay, we'll close that poll now. Great, thanks everybody for participating in that. Can see varying different levels of confidence, so hopefully we can increase that throughout this presentation, and we'll be looking at a different story at the end. So yeah, thank you for participating in that. I'm going to hand over to Nikki now to get started on the session.
Thanks, Em. So before we get into the detail of what we've actually changed, I'm going to talk through why it's so important for NIHR to actually make these changes. So as you may or may not be aware, NIHR's mission is to improve the health and wealth of the whole nation. However, it's impossible for us to actually achieve this without addressing health inequalities. Health inequalities are unfair and unavoidable differences in health across the population and between different groups in society. So groups of people such as those from ethnic minority groups, LGBTQ plus groups, those experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage, and many others often experience poorer health outcomes than other groups in society. And at the same time, these groups have historically been underserved by health and care research. So this situation means that the findings of health research are often not transferable to the people who stand to benefit most from them. And it allows health inequalities to continue and maybe even worsen. So although that we know as an organisation we need to reduce health inequalities, research could actually be contributing to them at the moment. So often health and care research participants don't reflect the population who need research most. For example, some research from the NIHR a couple of years ago highlighted that participants in heart failure research are actually around 20 years younger than the typical heart failure patient. And participants recruited to diabetes research didn't reflect the ethnic diversity of the general population of patients who actually have diabetes. And this is just two examples. There are many, many instances where the sample population of research isn't representative of those who would actually benefit most from the research. And this disconnect results in some problems, including that the benefits and side effects of research may not translate to real-world populations or settings. New treatments, services, or initiatives may not be deliverable or applicable to all groups. Important findings specific to different populations might be overlooked, and health inequalities are maintained. So a good and relatively recent example of how these problems can play out in the real world is the case of pulse oximetry. So the pulse oximeter is a device that was created in the 1970s to measure oxygen saturation in the blood in real time. The development of the pulse oximeter revolutionized diagnosis and treatment of conditions associated with low oxygen in the blood, and by 2010s, its use had become widespread, including monitoring patients before, during, and after surgery, in neonatal care, in assessment of lung function, in athletes, in those traveling to altitude, and its use was really critical during the COVID pandemic. So despite the benefits that this technology has undoubtedly brought to patients and the public, the benefits may not have been felt equally by all groups. So the original development and testing wasn't conducted in ethnically diverse populations. And it wasn't until a study in 2020 highlighted that pulse oximetry was 3 times less likely to detect low oxygen levels in Black patients that it was realised that there was a need for specific considerations for its use in people with darker skin. So since then, a systematic review has confirmed that pulse oximetry can overestimate oxygen concentration in people with darker skin. And as yet, the clinical implications of this are unknown, but it's highly likely to have impacted patient outcome in people with darker skin unequally. So how do we go about ensuring that research does have a positive impact on health inequalities rather than a negative one? One core way that we can do this at NIHR as a research funder is by ensuring inclusion is embedded in everything that we do, and especially in the research that we fund. So research that's designed, conducted, and communicated inclusively won't only address health inequalities, but it results in other benefits, not least of all, making better science. So there's numerous drivers in addition to the health inequalities angle and numerous benefits of inclusive research, which make it essential for us at NIHR to build it in as a requirement for funding. And these include improved scientific rigor. So using a diverse sample increases the accuracy, translatability, and reproducibility of your research. Increased patient safety and health outcomes. So treatments, services, and initiatives that may be ineffective or harmful if differences between groups are not defined. There are economic benefits, so there's less research waste as research outcomes can be better applied, and the result in improved practice and health outcomes translate into positive economic impacts, both at the individual and at a population level. There's a human rights and ethics argument for this as well. So there's a moral imperative to ensure that NIHR's research benefits all people in society and fulfills everyone's right to health and care, especially as we're publicly funded. And finally, there's the legal case. So there is the potential that research that's not inclusive can constitute discrimination under the Equality Act. So that's a whistle stop of why we're doing this and what the benefits might be. So hopefully everyone has a better understanding of that. So Emma's now going to take us through what we're actually changing.
Thanks, Nikki. So yeah, I'm going to move on now to an overview of the research inclusion changes to funding. So just to give you a bigger picture, this is a long-term programme of work with multiple phases, which will eventually encompass sex and gender, ethnicity, global health and infrastructure. But this year, phase 1 in 2024-25, we'll be rolling out changes to all domestic programmes, and we're running a small pilot with one infrastructure scheme in the coming months. If you're a researcher applying for an infrastructure scheme, it'll be made very clear in any guidance if this is applicable to that particular scheme. In 25-26, we'll be extending our approach to global health research, along with launching explicit policy requirements around sex and gender, and starting to engage with the sector around accounting for ethnicity. And then in the final phase in 26-27, we'll fully roll out the new conditions to all infrastructure awards, along with finalising our approach to ethnicity. But for today, we're just going to focus on the first phase of this work, which is inclusive research as a condition of funding for domestic programmes. And just to clarify, when we say domestic programmes, we're referring to all of NIHR's UK-based programmes. So this first phase doesn't apply to global health research. So what's important to note is that the requirements are not new, but they formalise and build on previous expectations and guidance around inclusion. However, we're moving beyond expectations to explicitly requiring inclusive research design as a condition of funding, and you'll be required to specifically cost for these inclusive design components. So, like I've just said, initially this will only apply to domestic awards, and this will be from late November this year. We don't have an actual date yet, but this when it will go live, but this will be communicated in the coming weeks. So do keep an eye out for further communications from NIHR. It's important to note that any calls that go out prior to the go live date are not affected by the changes, and anyone who already has NIHR funding will not be required to apply this retrospectively to their award, though wherever possible, we do encourage you to think about it. So the processes that we've changed internally to facilitate the new requirements include the standard application form, the applicant guidance, reviewer and committee forms and criteria, monitoring and publications. I'm not going to go into detail in all of these areas, but I'll give you an overview of the ones that are applicable if you are, the things you need to know if you're applying for NIHR funding. So the first stage in the process is the standard application form. So if you are applying for a personal and career development award, applicants must describe inclusion training needs relevant to their award in the training plan section of the application, along with including any training costs. Where you're required to write a narrative CV, you should include relevant inclusion training, skills, knowledge, and experience. Then for awards with a research component, applicants must describe how they've incorporated inclusive research design across the whole research lifecycle, and this needs to happen in the research plan section of the application form. The expectation of what to include will differ depending on which stage of the application process you're completing. So for an outline application or stage 1 application, the research plan must address inclusion in the background, target sample, and exclusions. For a full application or a stage 2 application, the research plan must address inclusion in the whole research life cycle. So this includes demonstrating engagement with the existing evidence base. With respect to costings, for that stage 1 outline application, costings should be included in the overall cost figure. For a full application, costings should be included in the application budget, and applicants will now find a specific research inclusion costing line for this. So what do we mean by inclusive design across the research lifecycle? So each step in the research lifecycle offers an opportunity for you to think inclusively about the research you're doing. So this includes the initial idea, research questions, selection of participants, data collection, data analysis, and impact. So basically, by critically reviewing and applying an inclusion lens to each step in the research design, informed by targeted public and patient involvement and knowledge mobilisation, you can identify complexities and specific needs about the lived experiences of different groups and can plan how these needs might be better met by the research. So this isn't a tick box exercise, but a way of applying that lens in a meaningful way to the development of research questions, definition of methods, theoretical frameworks, literature reviews, analysis and interpretations, as well as the write-up and dissemination of the work. This process is crucial for ensuring research is up to the task of overcoming injustices we currently see in research. So to understand more about the requirements, brief guidance will be included in the application form at both stages 1 and 2. There will also be a web page that will host full details and specifics about the new requirements. This web page will be linked to from the application form guidance. Now, this isn't live yet, but it will be in time for the rollout of the changes. And then if applicants require more specific support on how to make their research inclusive, then they can contact NIHR's Research Support Service, or RSS, which you're going to hear more about shortly. With respect to how the applications will be assessed, we've developed new criteria for peer reviewers and committees, and we're going to be delivering training to those reviewers and committee members in November, and programme teams can provide more details for that if that applies to you. In the long term, we will be seeking feedback on the implementation of the requirements and the quality of the inclusion elements within applications that are coming through. We've also set up an internal feedback form for programme teams to provide us with any information about issues, challenges, and things that are going well. And finally, just moving on to the very last two stages of the processes that we've changed, and that's monitoring and publications. So to ensure compliance, post-award researchers will be asked to report on inclusion elements during the progress reporting mechanism. So NIHR will be reviewing progress of research projects against their plan and reviewing any issues and their impact. It's important to note that throughout this process, we will take a continuous learning approach and will respond accordingly to ensure these changes can be applied effectively. And then just moving on to the publication stage, the NIHR's journals library publication guidance for authors reflects the new requirements, and we're in the process of reviewing and updating peer reviewer forms to support this, and we're going to be doing the same with open research as well. So I'm going to hand over to Becky and Chris to provide further information about the Research Support Service and how to embed inclusion across that research lifecycle. But just before I do that, a quick reminder, we're not answering questions live today, but do post your questions in the Q&A as we go along, upvote them, and the most popular ones we'll make sure are in our supporting guidance. So over to Becky and Chris.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm Chris. I work for the Research Support Service. So what is that? It's a part of the NIHR, sorry. And we advise researchers on their application for the NIHR and their research. We also advise around methodology, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, PPI, and also EDI or research inclusion. It was kind of formally done by the Research Design Service, and that was arranged locally in areas, so like the East Midlands. But the Research Support Service, it launched on the 1st of October 2023, and it's a single national service, so we give support to anyone in England. And basically, you can access any of these 8 hubs. You just follow to this link or through the QR code, and you can pick a hub and we can support you there. There are 3 hubs who have specialist centres, that's social care, and 2 for public health, and also King's College specialise in mental health. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk today about how to embed research inclusion into your research and your research applications. These are based on this new research inclusion requirements, and they're also link into our research design service EDI Toolkit that we created. Next slide, please. So the first one is to substantiate your research inclusion statements. So basically, a lot of researchers have good intentions, and we see in the applications that they say, oh, I will recruit a diverse sample, but they don't really explain how they're going to do that, or who's going to do it, or where that's going to happen. So you really need to substantiate that, and during the rest of these ways, you'll find ways to do that, and by looking at the toolkit, you'll be able to help do that. So we want to be confident that you're able to recruit from these underserved groups, and what skills does your research team have to carry out research inclusion? So have they got previous experience of recruiting to underserved groups? All those kind of things. But it's worth pointing out that this the EDI requirements, then they're not evaluating researcher characteristics. So next slide, please. So first off, when someone's writing a research application, they kind of write about the problem, the background, and they're wanting to write kind of the status of the problem, if you like. So what's the prevalence of the disease area they might be looking at, or what are the outcomes, how much it costs the NHS or social care, that kind of thing. So that's great, but we also want you to look at the health inequalities associated with your research area. And what are those? What are the groups that are being affected the most by this? And what kind of outcomes do they have? And basically, once you've learned those, you've looked at the literature, you've looked at the health inequalities, how is your research going to address those? If we have non-research inclusion, then it might be likely that we're kind of reinforcing those health inequalities. So we want to know how you're going to kind of target those groups in your research. Next slide, please. So yeah, how would we do that? Well, we can include areas underserved by research, and here we're talking more about kind of sites. So often we see that people want to do the sites in hospitals and with good transport links, because as researchers, a lot of us work in hospitals or universities, and the research is easier to do there. It's never easy to do research, but it's easier to do it there than other places. But there are lots of other sites that you could possibly use, or kind of community centres, but also you could use sites that are not that research active, but that might take a little time to get them to set up. And that's a condition that we want to see in the applications and how you're going to do that. And maybe you need to extend those timelines, and that links in with extra costs, which we'll talk about later. But the CRN are really good at kind of reaching out to participants, not just in those typical settings, and they do have a lot of resources like this tool on here, so it might be worth talking to them as well. Next slide, please. So we also want you to justify your research sample. So as a statistician and a trialist, sometimes you see, well, you always see inclusion and exclusion criteria, but sometimes people are excluding participants, and they're based on maybe biases or assumptions that might be not held. So one of the things I've seen is kind of with digital devices, sometimes people exclude older people over 60s because they feel like they might not be as computer literate as younger people. But that comes with a lot of assumptions, and we can address that. And also with digital inclusion, we might see that people, you must own a kind of a digital device, but there are things you can do around that. You can cost in for digital devices. And something that we see less often now is that excluding people who don't speak English, because the NIHR is very keen to push back on that and say you must include non-English speakers. But if you are making any exclusions, because sometimes they are justified in your clinical or social problem, that you justify that, because you might not be able to make a diagnosis on a certain age group or something along those lines. So you need to do that. And then to demonstrate your research sample, you need to collect characteristics on EDI, and how are you going to do that? And that links into our next slide. So we need to specify what demographic data that we will collect and how we plan to use it. So there are different ways of asking for data and different questions you can ask on each of the protected characteristics. In the toolkit, we have specific links out, and there is a lot of work going on this in East Midlands ARC at the minute as well. But here we've got a link to the DAISY guidance, which it demonstrates a way of asking around different protected characteristics. But people are usually willing to provide this data if they understand why you're collecting it. It's not a kind of put your, please fill in this questionnaire or demographics, because these are questions about your own identity and want to know what you want to use the data for. So you can include questions around identity in your analysis. So for quantitative studies, we always have a kind of a research question that is powered. And that research question always has to have like a statistical power with a sample size associated with it. So by doing these subgroups on kind of ethnicity or gender, we're not saying around doing hypothesis testing so much, but leaving the demographics there, the summary statistics, to for people to see themselves in the data. And you're also leaving it there for people to do meta-analysis with it in the future. And then for qualitative studies, you can contextualize your analysis with that. So it's you can embed your analysis with those protected characteristics or beyond the protected characteristics. Next slide, please. And I think I'm passing to Becky for number 6.
Thanks, Chris. So the 6th step is to budget for inclusion. And this is really fundamental to the changes which NIHR is bringing in. And so we know from our experience in the Research Support Service that the researchers that we work with are often concerned about adding in the costs of conducting research more inclusively. Even if it's something that they really want to do, they worry that their bids will appear less competitive in terms of cost. But with research inclusion becoming a condition of funding, it means that it's now an expectation that you'll do this. And we know that many researchers are already including these costs, but what is now required is to kind of flag them and collate them in one budget line. So this opens up the opportunity and the imperative to clearly identify what costs are needed to make your research more inclusive at the design stage. And then you'll need to specify those costs and justify them in your applications. Now, NIHR are really aware that because research inclusion costs are new for a lot of people, and certainly the idea of having a specific budget line, there's going to be some uncertainty. And so finance guidance is currently in development, and that's been kept relatively broad to try and encourage innovation. On a basic level, what we'd say is to cost for anything research inclusion related, be realistic about how much those things are going to cost, but importantly, to justify those costs. So what sorts of costs might be included? The RDS Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Toolkit gives some examples of the cost and time implications of genuinely inclusive research. And these costs are going to be study specific, so there's certainly no kind of one size fits all. But for some studies, it might include producing study materials in different formats and languages, for example, producing a British Sign Language kind of participant information video. It might include the costs of more inclusive or creative ways to do knowledge mobilization. It might mean hiring community venues to make involvement and participation more accessible. It might include covering research participants' childcare costs, or maybe recruiting or training community engagement workers to be able to support study recruitment or data collection. So there's lots of different possibilities, as well as some of the time implications of doing community engagement, and inclusive recruitment and retaining participants. In the toolkit, we also provide some suggestions for how to maximize value for money. So, for example, we caution against assuming that blanket translation of written research materials is the best way to go. It's not always appropriate if the population that you're trying to engage might not be literate in written languages, even if it's their first language. So paying and training community engagement workers can also be very rewarding. It can bring in fresh perspectives into the team and useful language skills, but it can also be a cost-effective approach. And we'd also encourage researchers to look at whether translated versions of your chosen outcome measure or an acceptable equivalent exist. Something to flag is that you may well find when you're putting your budget together that there's potential overlap between PPI and research inclusion budget lines. PPI budget line has been a long-standing aspect of NIHR costings. Now, the most important thing is to say that you include these costs. It isn't an exact science as to which budget line it goes into. And something else to highlight really is that this is a process through which NIHR is kind of recalibrating its understanding of what value for money means. And that means that for researchers too, there's the need to do the same. So although inclusive research may cost more, the benefits and the impacts should be felt much more broadly across society than cheaper research that is designed less inclusively. Next slide, please. So the 7th step is to consider how methodological innovation could overcome exclusionary aspects of conventional methods. And what we mean by that is that a lot of the conventional methods that we as researchers use are actually not the best ones for attracting and retaining people from diverse backgrounds. So often we see bids where patients or participants are expected to travel to hospital sites. That could be quite far away, especially for people who live in rural communities or who have accessibility needs. There's an expectation that people will be available weekday daytimes, that they'll be able to read and understand pretty hefty consent forms. The most commonly used qualitative methods, interviews and focus groups, typically require people to be able to quite spontaneously and confidently articulate their thoughts and experiences. And we know that that doesn't work for many people. So we could see it that exclusion is in effect baked into some of the staple methods that are used, even if that's not the intention. Now, there are ways to make these practices more inclusive. So, for example, working with translators and interpreters and making sure they're thoroughly briefed and trained. But there's also the opportunity to think about more innovative approaches where these are appropriate. So participatory and arts-based methods, photo voice, remote monitoring for trials, community-based recruitment. But in all cases, whatever methods you're considering, it's really important to engage with diverse public and community voices to help to drive the choice of appropriate methods. And that will also give you increased understanding of how to recruit and retain people from diverse backgrounds. Next slide, please. So carrying on with that topic then of thinking about public involvement and engagement, the 8th step is to demonstrate how your research is shaped by diverse and inclusive patient and public involvement and engagement. And it's really fundamental that ongoing relationships, and the emphasis on ongoing is important rather than the kind of parachuting in approach, which can sometimes happen. Ongoing relationships with diverse people and communities, especially those who are underserved and experiencing inequalities in relation to your research area, are kind of part of your whole research cycle. And that will be critical to being able to understand different communities' needs and to be able to design research that meets their needs rather than making assumptions about what different groups need and how to best engage them. Now, it's important to consider the diversity of your PPI members, but the kind of diversity that matters to each study will vary. So diversity might include EDI characteristics, not just the protected characteristics, but geography and socioeconomic status. It might include lived experience of the health or care issue being researched. It might also include how much experience people have of PPI. It can be important to get a range of those who are new to PPI as well as those who might be more established. But there is a need for caution with relying on established PPI groups, which can often lack diversity. It's also, in terms of language, helpful to perhaps consider attracting a range of perspectives and lived experience rather than making any claims to representativeness, particularly when fairly small numbers are involved. Now, it's also important to think about what the potential barriers to people being meaningfully involved are and to take steps to address these. And that means thinking about inclusive and flexible and creative approaches to involvement. And there are many examples out there in the research literature of strategies that people have used to engage with individuals and communities. So, for example, kind of focusing on trying to provide an activity which meets community members' needs, and then being able to kind of incorporate involvement as part of those activities. I've seen some really interesting examples around dance classes, other kind of community exercise classes, pregnancy yoga, for instance. Now, one point to be aware of is that sometimes there's a conflation between research inclusion and PPI. And so diverse and inclusive PPI is critical to kind of facilitating inclusive research, but alone it doesn't make your research inclusive. So when you're writing your research plan, you might find that there's some overlap between things you're saying about research inclusion and things you're saying about PPI. But if you only think about research inclusion in terms of your PPI, then you won't have met the requirements in terms of thinking through those wider aspects of data collection, data analysis, knowledge mobilization, and so on. Now, there's some useful resources which I've included on this slide here, some NIHR resources, a webinar recording and a document. And we'll post these into the chat and also make them available with the recording. Next slide, please. So the penultimate step is to plan inclusive and impactful approaches to knowledge mobilization. And when we talk about knowledge mobilisation, the way that NIHR defines that is the process that paves the way to research impact being realised by actively bringing stakeholders together throughout the whole research cycle. And so it's really important to see knowledge mobilisation as something that is, from the outset of a project beginning, not something that just happens at the end of a study. And knowledge mobilisation is kind of key in scaffolding the creation of new knowledge, being able to effectively share research findings, what we often refer to as dissemination, and being able to deliver impact. And it's really key that when you think about your knowledge mobilisation strategies, you're planning in work with diverse groups to make sure that different perspectives are feeding into what will make your research usable and impactful for everyone, helping to kind of fine tune some of the key messages from your research so that they're relevant and useful, and sharing those messages with relevant people, networks and communities, and thinking about some of the creative and accessible ways that you might be able to do that. It's also important to consider whether it's appropriate for your pathway to impact, to include and articulate the impact on health and care inequalities, and some funding calls will have a particular focus on that. Next slide, please. So the final step is to not think that you're alone in kind of working your way through this, and to use the resources available to help you. So one particular resource that we'd like to focus on is the Research Design Services EDI Toolkit. And this toolkit was developed by Chris and I with involvement of public contributors and the RDS EDI working group at the time. And it's structured into 8 kind of domains, so these kind of tiles on the screen. And these 8 tiles all kind of focus on a particular stage of the research cycle. So it follows the research cycle through. And if you go onto the website, you can access it through the QR code on the slide. Then when you click on each of the domains, the topics, it opens up some questions, guidance, case studies, so some real life examples, and a whole lot of other useful resources. And those resources relate to different populations, different contexts, and different methods. And you can also, as Chris mentioned, contact the Research Support Service to be able to get support, not just for the research inclusion aspects of your project, but we can support your project right from the start. And we're keen to hear from you at the earliest stage of your bid development. I'm going to hand back to Nikki now.
Thanks, Becky. So I'm just going to go through a few final points before we close the session. So one comment that is coming through a lot during the consultation phase of this work, but it's also come through in some of the Q&A today, is how much detail do you need to provide in your application? So in much the same way as when we introduced the PPI requirements, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago now, we're expecting that there's going to be a cross-sector learning curve for this. Some people are doing this really well already. Some people are not necessarily considering it at all. So we're expecting there to be a large learning curve across the board. And as a result of that, the amount of research inclusion information and the quality of how researchers approach this and our expectations around that will evolve over time. So at a stage 1 application, as Emma mentioned earlier, there's different requirements to what's needed at stage 2. In terms of the volume or amount of information that you need to include, stage 1 research plan must address research inclusion in your background, target sample and exclusions only. And then at stage 2, the detailed research plan requires you to think through the whole research life cycle, as Emma said earlier. But what we want to stress at this point, though, is that we aren't expecting researchers to account for every possible inequality for all underserved groups in every piece of research, because we know it's completely unrealistic and impossible. But target groups should be justified based on the need, so based on that background information and evidence base that you've reviewed. And there should be reasonable evidence provided, whether that's the evidence base or your PPI information, strategies put in place to ensure that recruitment, retention, and the validity of the outcomes for the selected groups are all in place, and that needs to be clearly articulated in your application. So any exclusions that you're including, as Becky and Chris touched on, should be fully considered, and any convenience type of sample and reasons for inclusion and exclusion will no longer be acceptable. We will be factoring in proportionality, and we want researchers to be thinking proportionality as well. So consideration should be given to the size of the award, the duration of the award, the career stage, and other relevant factors like that. So for example, we wouldn't be expecting the same volume of inclusive design elements in a short pre-doctoral award as we would in a large multi-site, multi-study trial. That's not to say early phase research or early career researchers are excluded from these conditions. They're certainly not. You know, we saw the example of the pulse oximeter earlier, and what can happen if it's not included at the earliest stages. But we will be thinking about it from proportionally, and we'll be reiterating that to our committees as well when they're making their funding decisions. There's a couple of questions come through in the chat about word count. We haven't been able to increase word count, so they are not changing. And I just want to also reiterate at this point that any calls that go out prior to the end of November, although we haven't got the final date yet, it'll be the very end of November. Anything that goes out prior to that, or if you've already done a stage 1 application at this point, those programs won't, or calls won't be affected by these changes. They only go live if it's a new call after the end of November deadline. Also, to reiterate, anyone who already has NIHR funding won't be required to apply this retrospectively to the award. Okay, and finally, where can you go for further support and guidance on this? So full research inclusion application guidance will be made available on the NIHR website in time for the new conditions rolling out in November. As we mentioned earlier, this webpage will be linked out from the application form from the other guidance sources, so they'll all be linked together. In the meantime, though, there's a number of resources and support service available to you. And that includes the Research Support Service, so Becky and Chris that have been on the call today, and their wider team. The EDI Toolkit that has been linked in the chat, that's been shown earlier in the presentation. And finally, we've got an NIHR Research Inclusion Toolkit Hub, which is available via NIHR Learn, and that includes specific guidance on diversity data, inclusive communications, and lots of other things. So really worth a look on there. Finally, just want to reiterate to you, for those of you who are committee members, we are running a separate training session on this in November. Please, if you haven't heard about this or you haven't received any information about this, you can get in touch with your programme team contacts to get further information and sign up for that. And I'm just going to finally hand over to Emma.
So just a couple more slides before we finish. We want to really just revisit the poll from the start and see if your understanding confidence has improved following what we've covered today. So we're just going to start the poll in the same way that we did earlier on. So you'll see that pop up on your screen if you could just complete that. So we'll just leave that a couple of minutes just to get everybody's votes in. Can see they're coming through, so we'll just give it another minute or so. Another few seconds. Okay, we'll close that poll now. Just see what's come through. Okay, so there is a bit of an increase on the good and very good, which is great to see, and we're great to see that, you know, confidence has improved. Obviously, there's still a few that has still got some concerns around that, but like we've mentioned a lot, there's going to be a lot more guidance coming out and a lot more support material, and that will really help you with this, hopefully, and obviously access the Research Support Service if you need any extra support or guidance around this area. So that's it for today. We just want to thank you so much for your time. And we've had a lot of people here today, and, we're really great to see so many attending. We would really ask now if you can please complete our post-event survey, which is going to get posted in the chat, because this is really going to help us develop what other training or what future training we put on and what resources we develop around this. So we really would appreciate your feedback for that. And the recording of this today will be circulated, and it'll be on our NIHR YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that's circulated around to you all along with the links soon. So yeah, thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.